Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CPAC Lounge. Today, we will be talking about a very poignant and relevant subject in music in 2020: racism and Eurocentricity in music theory. Today, we also have a very special guest, Miss Anna Lopez. Anna has a BM in flute performance and is currently working on her MA in music history at CSUF. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anthony. Thanks for having me today on this Thursday right before Thanksgiving break. Woo!
Today we'll be talking mostly from our experiences as Cal State Fullerton students, and we'll be talking about our music theory classes in particular. Later, we'll discuss the arguments presented by Dr. Philip Ewell in his paper Music Theory and the White Racial Frame. And after, we'll be discussing what now and how do we move on knowing this and how do we diversify the way we teach music theory. I hope you all stick around and enjoy my thoughts on racism and Eurocentricity in music theory. So our school, like most music schools, teach theory in a very chronological order. Would you agree?
Definitely.
So, yeah, we start off with their foundations with the elements of music, as they call it, and then we talk about tonal harmony and how the Baroque and classical composers really used functional harmony, and the Romantics later blur those lines a bit, and in the 20th century, they throw those ideas, for the most part, out the window and transform the way we think about music and the way we listen to music. Would
Yeah.
you?
I definitely think that's a good summarization of our music theory sequence. You mentioned elements of music. That idea is pretty problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I read this article by Professor Matthew Tran Adams about this problem. He basically describes how this way of thinking and how thinking of the elements of music as the basis for all music is really wrong, because he specifically describes how African music and of course other non-western musical ideas can't be analyzed and can't be understood with these elements of music. They're merely elements of Western art music, and we don't really use that full title. And later in the article, he describes how this mentality really leads to the establishment of this Eurocentric frame. So let's talk about our theory sequence in particular.
Yeah. Okay.
So, in our lower division theory classes, what do we talk about?
So, most of what we talk about in our lower division theory classes is part writing and analyzing for part chorales. We go over what tonal harmony and how composers like Bach, Haydn, and Mozart use this tonality to create their music. There's definitely a bunch of rules regarding all of this stuff.
Yeah, and already we could start to see a pattern with the composers that we talk about. They are all, surprise, surprise, dead white, specifically European men, which to some degree, I don't know if you agree, is understandable based on the output of Western art music of this time. For the most part, we don't get to hear popular and folk traditions until we move on to the Romantics and into the 20th century.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of that issue is also because of how we've treated these works. I'm sure stuff was going on that we just don't get to study. But I definitely understand why we're studying this, but it's when we go from studying Bach that the problem of Eurocentrism progresses. So let's talk about the 20th century. I remember from taking 351C, this was basically the first class that we get to talk about people of color in our anthologies and in our music history studies.
Yeah, exactly. And it isn't until the third anthology that we get our first person of color. That's another problem in itself that we can talk about for days, but I do appreciate how in 351C we learn about Scott Joplin, we learn about William Grant Still and Revueltas and Villalobos, but let's go into the main problem here. Let's talk about music theory. I'm actually in Music 320, and for the most part, This course lines up with 351C almost exactly. Almost exactly, because there's one big difference. We don't cover the important composers of color in music theory.
Yeah, definitely. We don't even get to go over jazz theory, but as we all know, living in this 20th century, 21st century, sorry, my bad, jazz plays such an important role in Western art music in the 20th century.
Exactly. Not to mention music of other cultures, like gamelan, like Latin American music, like specifically African music. Composers of the 20th century seek inspiration from all over the world because of globalization. And we only study the techniques and the style of white Europeans. Um, Take Debussy. When we learn about Debussy, they glaze over gamelan and his influence from gamelan music. They basically say it's an important toolbox and he uses pentatonic scales to reflect this, but we don't learn what gamelan is.
Yeah. I still don't know what gamelan is.
Yeah, but we spend so much time talking about the 12-tone row and we learned about pitch class set theory and all of that, but we don't even talk about jazz. So let's talk about jazz.
Yeah, so now that I think about it, when I did my undergrad, we barely covered jazz. And right now, I'm currently in jazz history, and I still don't understand it. And I think part of that is my lack of knowledge in jazz theory itself. Whenever Professor Cunliffe asks us to talk about a piece, I have no idea what to say because I don't know any of their language.
So jazz, it really comes from this African musical culture and is derived from slave work songs and spirituals, correct?
Yeah, so jazz actually started as a way for African Americans who were forcibly removed from their homes to find a way to communicate with each other and to find a way to talk about their feelings that the white man didn't exactly understand because, you know, they didn't have that kind of culture.
And that's exactly why you can't talk about jazz without talking about race. It's so ingrained in jazz. So the 20th century, the composers of the 20th century, they sought inspiration from this genre and really integrated jazz into the world of Western art music. Think of composers like Darius Milhaud and Kurt Weill, and even Bernstein and Gershwin. The output of these two composers, both Western art music and their popular music, was full of jazz influence. But why don't we talk about Scott Joplin in music theory? Why don't we talk about the father of ragtime, the one who started it all and started this blending of Western art music and this African American popular musical genre? We talk about the compositional styles of white men in 20th century techniques, but why not people of color?
I agree. So, bridging this together, let's talk about Dr. Philip Ewell. As some of you may know, Dr. Ewell is a music theorist, and many of his publications focus on critical race examinations of music theory. His latest paper, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, was presented at the Annual Society of Music Theory conference in 2019, and as you may expect, it kind of caused just a little bit of a little ruckus within music theorists in the United States.
Yeah, his paper and his presentation sparked lots of controversy from both sides of the aisle. But let's talk about what he says. He talks about the lack of diversity within the profession of music theory itself, and he talks about the lack of diversity in the musical examples that we get in our music theory textbooks. He has a chart of all the top music theory textbooks of universities, and details how many of those pieces are written by people of color. And two of the ones he talks about, the Cosca and the Francoli, an average of 3% of the pieces that we study in those two textbooks were written by non-white composers. But the bulk of his presentation was calling out Heinrich Schenker.
Yeah, so according to Dr. Ewell, Schenker is viewed in the music theory field as the Beethoven of music theory. Did you know that many graduate programs in music theory actually require you to study Schenkerian theory and analysis?
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because Schenker was very open and honest about his ideas regarding race. He published journals detailing his views on black people, on Japanese people, and even people of Slavic descent. However, his views on black people and black music were even more explicit. He says that black music were completely falsified and dishonest expropriations of European music. Yeah, exactly. His racism can also be linked to his own theoretical works. Dr. Ewell quotes Schenker in which he talks about the Western diatonic scale, and he says that not all notes were created equal, and he compares this idea of thinking them as equal to equal rights. And Schenker himself believed that not all men are created equal, and to ever believe so is out of the question.
Wow, that's some strong words. But the focus isn't really on how racist he was, but how scholars view his work as the end-all and be-all of music theory, and how it's quote-unquote the superior theoretical method, ironically enough so.
Yeah. In all honesty, it's not very surprising that a white man born in the mid-19th century had explicit racial commentary in his publications. But the more problematic thing is how scholars of today justify or sanitize, as Yule calls it, his theoretical works from his racist views. Dr. Yule also says that Schenker himself believed that his unified view should be considered a whole, and argues that Schenker would link his racism to his very own theoretical concepts. In a response by Dr. Timothy Jackson, he negates the ideas that Schenker was racist. He goes on by saying that Schenker was Jewish, that it's impossible, that he has this German nationalistic idea, and he basically excuses and negates his racist point of view and white supremacy. And on the other side, Dr. Rich Pellegrin, who is Ewell's colleague, says that it's important to teach his theory, but it's also important to tell students of his racist point of view and his racist ideas and allow the student to make do with that information.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting points of view. Don't really agree with that first one, but whatever. It is really interesting though that scholars seem to worship his music theory and turn a blind eye to his racism, much like some music historians do with certain composers. But, going back to that points at a systematic issue in music theory itself, because the history of music theory is rooted in the compositional works of white men, and it's enforced by the white men that studied those works. The field today is dominated by white men, and white people make up more than 90% of jobs in music theory.
Yeah, we gotta diversify that. So let's go into the hard part of today's topic. So how do we move on knowing all of this? As a future collegiate level educator, how do you think we should reform and modify the way we teach music theory?
So going off of that, I think Pellegrin's idea is a really good one. I think it's important to be able to emphasize the racism within the stuff that we study. Yeah. However, classical music is our, livelihood, and it's really important to understand the background of that. But again, classical music has been problematic for a long time. But I think one of the ways we can reform and modify the way we teach theory is honestly shortening the length of our music theory sequence. There's no need for 4 semesters.
Yeah. Yule even says that.
Yeah, we don't need 4 semesters. We can compress most of these things into 1 if we're really being honest. It just requires a really good professor and students who are willing to pay attention. But yeah, we can definitely shorten that music theory sequence. jazz theory is so important, especially now that we're moving a lot away from classical music as a society. We're all about pop, and a lot of pop comes from jazz. And just being able to learn about that language would have definitely made me a more confident musician. And I definitely would have spoken up more in jazz history. But yeah, I think it's best if we can identify the racism, shorten the sequences itself, and just talk about other musics and other ways to approach that theory.
Okay, so as a musicologist who is studying wind band music, how important is learning jazz theory to you?
So for me, I think it's super important. A lot of wind ensemble music definitely takes its inspiration from jazz. And one of the pieces I studied really closely last year was Omar Thomas's Of Our New Day Begun. Some of you may know Omar Thomas, but he is actually a very big jazz composer. And having to study that music without having all of these, like the background of jazz theory, I was just like, oh, this sounds jazzy, but I couldn't tell you exactly how it sounded jazzy. And I felt like that made me sound kind of dumb.
And in a way, diversifying the way we think about music theory will help the future generations of scholars, the future generations of music theorists, musicologists, and musicians. And if we start with jazz, we can later implement musical cultures from all over the world, and we'll implement them in our theory sequences and learn the theory behind gamelan finally. It's going to take a lot of trial and error, but I think it's essential. We need to diversify the way we talk about music, because we're getting more brown composers. We're getting more female composers.
Woo!
And we're not going to be able to talk about the 21st century the way we talked about the 18th, the 19th, and even the 20th century.
Definitely.
So yeah, those are our thoughts on racism and Eurocentrism in music theory. And I hope you could join us next week where Anna talks about
Taylor Swift and her Reputation album as a song cycle through her use of the mix and the sound box.
Thank you so much.